All right. It's Friday night.
It's a Friday night in December.
Yeah.
Perfect training time, right?
Yes, it's nice. Well, it's nice time of year. It's
Yeah.
it's in the 30s here. That's a little chilly. It's almost like it's winter.
Oh, was it like a high of 30 in the 30s or lows?
No, the high gets into 40s, so but yeah, 30s is yeah, well, we did that Team G Memorial ride
Oh yeah,
last
last
weekend,
Friday.
and that was in the 30s. And
My Garmin had us at 26, I think.
oh, okay, yeah.
It was cold. That
That
was a
was
cold
cold.
morning. Well,
That
they
was
said that the newspaper said that that morning was the coldest morning at McCarran in
mm.
600 and something days.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And then I think
So,
they registered the at 24 degrees or something like that.
okay.
So obviously we were right by the airport. I mean, that's where we
Yep.
were. And then there was shady. I mean,
Oh,
honestly, it was a cold morning for sure.
it's amazing how that sun makes a big difference. But
Yeah.
so I've this is off season, so I've just been riding on indoors right now, just trying to minimum effective dose right now. That's all I'm doing. So I'm just trying to
It's
hold on.
amazing how little you really have to
Hmm.
do
Yep.
to maintain. So I've been trying not to run that much. Still dealing with a little bit of a hip issue. But I've been running on that weekly Zwift race,
Oh,
15
okay.
minutes, 15-minute it's a duathlon. So you run 15 minutes after you ride. And I'm still running almost the exact same pace every week. And I'm only
Yep.
running one other time.
That's great.
And I'm still like, under 4 minutes a K.
Hmm.
And yeah, minimum effective dose.
Yeah. Well, and I know you don't monitor your weight so much, but
Yeah.
monitoring the weight, or staying the same weight makes a big difference in running.
Yeah.
So I know one of my, issues in terms of why my running is degrading a little bit is because my weight is sneaking up, and you got to carry that, and it is harder to continue to run the same pace if you weigh heavy.
No, you're exactly right. But and I think it's interesting because it's a good segue because we're going to talk about heart rate.
Yep.
And if you think about it, you actually could run the same pace.
Hmm.
You would just have to do it at a metabolic cost that is greater.
Yep. That's true.
Like you could go out and run at, let's say, 5 minutes per kilometer,
Hmm.
right? Whereas when you were lighter, your heart rate might have been 120.
Yeah.
And you're heavier, you could run the same pace.
Hmm.
Your heart rate is just going to be higher and it's going to feel harder because metabolically you're working harder.
I love that, but I'd actually look at it differently. I can race at the same heart rate, but because I'm heavier, I'm going to be slower.
See, that's the difference between a race pace and training pace,
Yeah.
right? And that's a really, you're right. Your race pace, your max velocity will be less. You're
Right.
absolutely right because
Right.
the thing that's limiting you is probably your metabolic system. And we're going to see that in heart rate. That's
Yeah.
really, but yeah, and then so training, what would happen? Technically, you'd be in a different training zone,
Hmm.
right? It would be like instead of like that 120 heart rate, you might be zone one. Now you're at 5 minutes per kilometer or 8 minutes per mile. You're at 130, 135. Now you're in zone two.
Right.
So physiologically, you're actually doing something different, but you could still do the same. Obviously,
Well,
you
we
could still do.
jumped into our topic really fast here.
Yeah, we sure did.
And I love this
It was a
because,
great transition.
yeah, no, this is great because what you're talking about is how do you monitor intensity in essence during running. Now, during cycling, we spent a lot of time on talking about power meters.
Yeah.
Swimming's a little bit different. That's sort of a hard because really most swimmers don't have heart rate nor power, and so you really end up looking more
Your
at pace
pace.
clock. That's
Yeah.
right. But running, man, you really lots of people just monitor heart rate.
Yep. Well, I think it's heart rate and pace,
Hmm.
right?
Right, heart rate, pace, and rating of perceived exertion, which is a psychological perception of how hard you feel the exercise is. Yep,
Yeah.
yep. Those would be the
Yeah.
three big.
And if you think about it, heart rate monitors, this is going to sound weird, but they're a relatively new thing,
Hmm.
right? So, John, when did you get your first heart rate monitor? You've been in the game a long time.
Well, it would have been back in the 80s, actually.
But,
Polar
but
heart rate monitors started up in the 80s. Actually, I don't know when they started, but I found out about them in the 80s. even before I went for my master's degree, and was able to secure a heart rate monitor way back then.
Yeah, but you were in academia, right?
Not at
And
that stage. I
okay,
was just training and racing and found out about the
and you had a
ability.
heart rate monitor back then,
I did, yeah.
because when I was doing that high level orienteering and running, and
Hmm.
I had a watch,
Yep.
but I never had a
Yep.
heart rate monitor.
Hmm.
And when I started out at the University of Calgary and I was studying in kinesiology there, that was the first time I ever saw
Mm.
people with heart rate monitors, and they were the national team speed skaters and
Yep.
some of the physiologists working with them, and these things were big.
Yeah, they
They
were.
weren't
The
like
watches
they
were
weren't,
big.
the watches were big. Right? I can remember seeing these guys with these huge watches going around the Olympic Oval on their skates, and I'm like, what is on their wrist? Like,
Yeah.
what is this? And obviously, you learn as you go. But this was probably 1990,
Hmm.
and it was still, it wasn't something that, unless you were an elite athlete, you didn't have access to this. So yes, so now maybe think about it with the general public
Hmm.
in endurance. When do you think the average triathlete started actually being able to monitor their heart rate?
Boy, I don't know. That's a good question. It wasn't, you know, I have two triathlon careers early,
Right.
in the 80s and early 90s, and then later in the 2000, 2007, I got back into it. And when I got back in 2007, people were pretty consistent in terms of having heart rate monitors or finding a device to measure heart rate during exercise. So somewhere in that window,
Yeah.
it would have been. How about you? When did you start
Well,
seeing?
I was training soccer players in my previous life,
Mm,
doing speed and
mhm.
agility training and athletic training with soccer players. And I can remember buying like 5 or 6 of them because I had a company, and I
Yeah.
bought 5 or 6 of them, and I put them on the athletes when we were training. And that would have been 2005,
Hmm.
2004, where I got to the point where I think they were like $100 each, and they're
Yep.
polar,
Yep.
but they literally were a watch and heart rate.
Heart rate. That's it.
That was it. I think
Nothing
there was a
else.
stopwatch. I think there was actually, you could get it was a stopwatch and heart rate
Yeah,
and
yeah,
time.
that's probably right. That's right. Yeah, and time of
And
day, obviously, but
and
but
that
yeah,
and
you
that was
couldn't. I
there was
don't even
no
think we ever downloaded data. It was just you were just looking at heart
oh
rate.
yeah. I would ask, I mean, okay, so we just did these intervals or like a yo-yo test
Yep.
or something. And I'm like, okay, what's your heart rate? And I would ask each individual person,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Or I'd be like, okay, during this effort, I want your heart rate
Yeah.
to be this.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, but we weren't collecting data, like
Mm-mm.
other than like I would write it down,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't like we downloaded. I think that you could at that point with some of them, some of them actually download them into an Excel, like a CSV.
Yeah, like now that you're talking about that, when I did my master's and then my dissertation, I was using a recorded heart rate telemetry or without being connected. So the chest strap was sending a signal, and we had a device that would pick up that signal that would then go right into the computer and read that way. So it wasn't even reading through a watch; it was reading the signal from the transmitter, which was the chest strap. So yeah, that would have been mid '90s at that point that we were doing that.
So I think we come a long way to now the fact that many people, and not just triathletes, have a heart rate monitor on them all the time.
It's hard to imagine going out for a run without putting my chest strap on right now.
Yeah.
I still, although I've lost one, I don't know where it is. All right, but here's the question I stump my students with.
Yeah. Okay.
I always ask them at the beginning of any physiology class I'm teaching, and this right now it's physiology of endurance performance. We just wrapped this up, and I always ask them, why do you measure heart rate?
Yeah, that's a great one.
And it is amazing the answers that I get back. And a lot of them circle around the real reason why we measure heart rate. They use it, something like, well, you try to figure out how hard the heart's working. And no, that's not actually it. We're figuring out how hard your intensity is. Well, yes, that is, but that's not why we really measure heart rate. And, we go through this whole, discussion. I have them throw out different ideas. And the bottom line is heart rate is a good predictor of rate of oxygen consumption. That's why we measure heart rate, because that VO2, that rate of oxygen consumption, that tells us something about how the body is taking that chemical energy and transforming it to mechanical energy to allow the muscle to shorten. And the VO2, that's the number that we want. That's the information we want. But to measure VO2, we got to wear a mask, we got to be hooked up to a computer. And although there's, some more portable devices now, it's, a $20,000, $30,000 piece of equipment. The portable ones are $50,000, $60,000. And so you don't see a lot of those out there and on the streets, but you've got it's very cumbersome device to collect and then analyze the oxygen that you're breathing in and exhaling.
Okay, so John, that's a great answer, and you're spot on. Like, I couldn't agree more. And that's why you collect heart rate data.
Yeah.
But why do the masses collect heart rate data?
I don't know. It's
Because
obviously
you're not the
part of
masses.
marketing too. It's
I think that's the number one reason, is because you should,
yeah,
right? Because you need to be training in this zone.
yeah.
And there's very little understanding of the in the general public about why you should be training in these zones. Oh, well, you need to train that zone because that's the fat burning zone,
Yeah.
right? Like, how many times have you heard that
Yeah.
analogy? Or you need to be training in this zone because of this, and it's all based off of your heart rate data. And it's more marketing hype probably than actually understanding the physiology behind it and utilizing it properly.
Well, and I'll even take it a next step and say a lot of it, if you look at a chart in the wall, that chart in a gym or what have you, or even online, those heart rate zones probably have nothing to do with your heart rate zones. And the problem is that a lot of them are based upon lots of data points from lots of different people, but those lots of different data points may not represent what that person's doing individually.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because even like our Garmin company and our Polar company, they have these algorithms that are based off of population data. Even though they're collecting individual data, they still oftentimes are not accurate for the individual person. And like, John, you have a very low resting heart rate, and you have a very low training heart rate. Right. Sometimes I look at your data and I'm like, oh my gosh, like John is like running at 110.
Yeah,
and I'm like, I don't know if I should go rescue him. But that's an individual to you, right?
Yeah,
and then I have a really low heart rate data compared to a lot of people that I know, and I'm higher than you.
Yep.
And so those charts they're not a very good indicator. And so that being said, it's not easy to actually figure out where you should be on your heart rate.
No, right.
And just by having the number doesn't really tell you a lot.
No, and a lot of them are, age predicted charts. And because, for a 57-year-old, you'd subtract, there's a number of different formulas, but you can subtract 57 from 220 as a basic way. But then some equations say, well, you got to count for your resting heart rate and all this. Well, they're all predictions.
Yeah.
And they're just predictions of what the zones are. But the zones really are built on knowing rate of oxygen consumption, because that's going to tell us really what's going on physiologically. When we do research papers and we try to, we present the intensity of the exercise. If we just present heart rate, we're not going to get the data published, because it's not good enough for a research paper to describe the intensity of exercise. You have to measure and report VO2, the rate of oxygen consumption, because that's telling you what's going on metabolically, and heart rate is only related to that. Now, the relationship is pretty strong most of the time, but to know VO2, I actually need to know heart rate, how fast the heart's beating in beats per minute. I need to know stroke volume, how much blood is being pumped out of the heart with each beat. And then the third thing I need to know is how much oxygen is being extracted from the blood by the muscle. Well, the assumption is it's by the muscle, which is, where the
mostly by the muscle,
because of aerobic system. And so you need to know those three things: heart rate, stroke volume, and what we call an AVO2 difference, the difference in oxygen within the arterial blood and the venous blood. So if you subtract the oxygen from those two types of blood, then you figure out how much oxygen was extracted from the blood. Those three things make up VO2. So we're actually trying to predict from those three things, VO2 from 1.
Yep.
And so most of the time it's pretty good.
Yeah, it's not a bad proxy, to be
No,
honest.
no. Steady state exercise, submax exercise, you're probably pretty good in terms of predicting. But if you start changing things like your blood volume, or you start changing things like how much oxygen is in the air, well, then those relationships, those things will influence the relationship between heart rate and VO2.
And we'll circle back around, and your weight.
Yeah, right. Well,
Right.
that's right, because VO2, we typically describe that relative to your weight.
Yeah. Well, that's the only really way to do it, right?
Yep.
So it's interesting. My Garmin watch, for example, it has a VO2 predictor, which is garbage.
Yeah.
Because it has no idea, like it knows sort of what I weigh, but it doesn't know on any given
Yeah.
day. And I don't update it
Yeah.
all the time. I guess if I had the Garmin scale, maybe it
Mhm.
could update it all the time. But it's got like a guesstimate. But if I'm 5 pounds heavier or 5 pounds lighter, that number is not very good anymore. And no, so John, you're spot on with your stuff. But then again, if we take it back, so then how does the average consumer actually utilize this data and make sense of it, other than it's a cool number to know? And actually, before we go to that, John, what is your maximum heart rate?
Actually, I don't know what it is right now, but I can tell you what my heart rate is for different paces.
Okay.
And that is, and that's where exactly I think where you're going is people need to understand how their heart rate responds for them during exercise, during swimming, biking, and running. Now, swimming's a little bit harder to get heart rate, but they're coming out with new devices, and you're actually getting information on that. But biking and running, heart rate would be a little bit different based upon body position, and one's weight bearing, one's not. But you've got to understand how heart rate's responding for you in different conditions.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so why I asked you is because I think you would be the prototypical person to ask that question, because I think your maximum heart rate is going to be lower than the predicted value.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
And I could last time we did the test, what was that, a couple of years ago?
Probably 2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, we didn't do a max heart rate test. We did a VO2 test, and there's actually a different protocol for finding your max heart rate.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say actually you can get both of those. I know what you mean, but you can get both of those from that test. And the critical thing is, to get your true heart rate max, you've got to do a test. It's not something you just go out and just do. You got to actually have a protocol to actually determine what that maximum heart rate is.
You want to know how you get your heart rate max?
How do you get your heart rate max?
I'll tell you how I get mine. A Zwift race.
Oh yeah, right.
I had a Zwift race. This is now, I guess it was a year and a half ago. And I still remember, because it was the hardest Zwift race I ever did.
Yeah.
And I was in California. I brought my trainer with me. I didn't have a fan. And I was outside.
Nice.
I was outside at night. It was like 6 o'clock at night, no fan, but there was a little breeze. I'm like, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
And man, my heart rate, like, it went to 184. Okay. Ooh. My heart rate, I have never seen a number other than that day above 177.
Nice.
But I added the heat component to it, right? So now we're utilizing more oxygen now to actually help keep me cool as well.
Yeah.
More blood flow to the skin, more. So it was really an interesting thing. I'm like, so is this now my new max heart rate? Because I hit it one time, and I saw the numbers, and I looked at the data afterwards. I'm like, oh, it must have just been an artifact, because I've never been in the since I started measuring, never been in the 180s. And I looked at it, and it was it was good. It was good, clean data all the way up. And so then, what good is that number?
Actually,
I don't know.
No, that's right. And see, when you're asking me more about my heart rate maxes, it's like that doesn't really tell me. I know this sounds odd, and it's weird people hearing us say this. That doesn't really tell me anything. I don't care what my max heart rate really is. I care what my max VO2 is.
Exactly. And
my max heart rate, I would just take whatever the heart rate is that corresponds to that max VO2. So it's not the heart rate.
But
maybe you think, oh, look at my heart rate right now. It's 72 beats per minute.
yeah.
That has no meaning, because my resting heart rate really is down under 40. So obviously my heart rate's higher now because, well, it's lots of things going into it, but it doesn't even, this heart rate doesn't even reflect how much oxygen I'm consuming. And so,
But why I mentioned the max heart rate is so many people build their zones that they
yeah,
train
that's right. Right.
as percentages of their maximum
Hmm.
heart rate,
No.
right? Many of the formulas out there for calculating your zones are that, because most people aren't going to go in and do a VO2 max test or VO2
Hmm.
test and actually get their zones built out properly.
Yeah.
And and because it's not an easy thing to do, especially during COVID.
Hmm.
Like
No.
going into a lab and get this stuff actually tested accurately. Even if you go to some of the gyms that do this testing, they don't do they don't do
Hmm.
max, they do submax,
Right.
submaximal VO2, and then they're predicting.
It's still guesswork, and it is. And so now you're trying to use heart rate to predict VO2, but now you're trying to predict heart rate at exercise intensities that you're not doing it during the test. And there's reasons you do that. It's safer. It's, liability is less, but now you're predicting higher intensities from a submax test, and you're predicting something that you're predicting something else of. So there's a lot of, you
Yeah,
know,
garbage in, garbage out, right?
there's a lot of slop in the gears. That's all.
Yeah,
But
no,
but
it's true.
but I value heart rate, and so I don't want people to hear that I say heart rate's not
Oh,
worthwhile. I actually
you
I
already
have a
said
heart.
that you wear it all the time.
I wear it all the time, and when I go out for running, I don't have my heart rate monitor on. I'm like, oh man, this is terrible. All I got is my wrist based, and this wrist based thing is terrible during exercise. It does not do a good job. But I I record heart rate. I go back and look at my heart rate. I like to know what my heart rate is when I'm doing a 5K versus a 10K versus a half versus a full. And I know those ranges based upon looking at and measuring heart rate. And so there's a lot of value to it, but there's value because you got to know the physiology behind it and what it's doing and what it's telling you, what it's not telling you.
Yeah. No, you're once again, you're 100% right. Like I, right now in the off season, I don't really wear a heart rate monitor,
Mm-hmm.
especially running, because I really don't care right now. I just want to get some miles in to keep
Yep.
it. And right now, other than that one Zwift race, which actually I do have heart rate because you have to have heart rate for the race,
Yep.
I really don't care right
Mm-hmm.
now. But as I get into my structured training, I absolutely want heart rate for everything, because it dictates, to me, it dictates more. It's more important than power. It's more important than pace, because it truly is telling me metabolically what is happening.
Yeah. Well, and see, I say I don't look at heart rate every time, but I record it,
No,
and then
I'm
I
the
can
same
always
as
go
you.
back and I
Exactly.
can look at it. So I'm a victim of wanting to still have the data there to be able to go back and look. So it is funny how that is. So
Yeah. And oftentimes, like running too, perceived exertion is more important for me. It's like today's supposed to
yeah,
be an easy run. I'm
yeah,
running easy.
yeah,
Today's supposed to be a tempo run. I kind of know
mhm,
that. I know that pace.
yep,
And then anytime I'm doing intervals, I actually could care less about my heart rate, because
mhm,
I'm trying
yep,
to go hard, right?
yep.
And if it's 160 or 164, it doesn't make a difference to me. I'm going as hard as I can go for that given distance or
And
pace.
I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought that up because perceived exertion is important. And I always like looking perceived exertion and then looking at my heart rate.
Yeah.
And I try to always, pair those up. Or, sometimes I'm feeling like it's hard and I look at my heart rate and I'm like, okay, well, this is what I can do. And
Yeah.
that's it. All right, so we got a comment here from Max. Do mustaches correlate with higher heart rate variability?
They absolutely do. Variability, and which we're going to talk about later, but because you feel a little bit better about yourself and you're more on the
That's right.
parasympathetic side. So yes, absolutely.
All
I
right,
love
so that's a nice segue into the second part of this talk tonight. So, heart rate by itself, how fast the heart beats, tells us something about rate of oxygen consumption most of the time. Now, remember, there's three things that VO2 is determined that determines VO2: heart rate, how fast you're beating. That's what we're talking about. Stroke volume, how much is pumping with each beat, and then oxygen extraction from the blood. So like if someone walks up behind me right now and scares me in some way, my heart rate will go up. That doesn't mean my VO2 goes up.
Right.
That could be a smaller stroke volume and heart just beats really fast, but doesn't pump a lot of blood out. So we got to keep this in mind that that heart rate by itself only tells us some information and it doesn't always tell us exactly what we want to know. And so I know you brought this topic up and I'm glad you did because there's other information in heart rate that is not necessarily how fast the heart's beating.
Yeah. So what you're getting at is talking about heart rate variability.
Yeah.
And, this was first brought to my attention 8 or 9 years ago. And I had a grad student that he was looking at heart rate variability post-concussion. And I'd never heard of it before. And he was looking at it as a metric for determining if someone had had a concussion. So then, I was like, well, I got to learn, because I'm a sponge. I want to learn about this. And so, I took a deep dive into this metric. And this is a really interesting metric because what it is measuring is the time between heart rate, beats of the heart. And honestly, before I kind of took a deep dive into this, I didn't really think much of it.
Yeah.
Like, what's the difference? If your heart's beating, for example, at 60 times a minute, so it's beating 1 time per second, you'd think it was beating 1 time per second, right? But it actually is not. And so one time it'll beat at exactly 1 second. The next time, 0.99 seconds. The next time, 1.01 seconds. The next time, 0.98 seconds. Next time, 0.97 seconds. And so the time in between is really, really interesting stuff. And, and it can actually tell us a lot more, I think, than just purely the heart rate number. The problem is getting that down to the millisecond and actually collecting it properly is actually really difficult to do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's getting to the point where many people in the endurance world are starting to have this metric. So on your higher end watches, they're measuring your heart rate variability.
Yep.
Your Apple Watch, you can get heart rate variability. Your Whoop band, your Oura Ring, all of these things, anything that's measuring nowadays, any sleep trackers are often measuring heart rate variability. But the tricky thing is with it, we need to first understand what it is and then why it's ultimately important. So why it's ultimately important is it actually is really responds to our nervous system and what our nervous system is doing. And so just to take a little step back, we're looking at your autonomic nervous system. And your autonomic nervous system is kind of what it implies: autonomic, automatic. It's what's happening subconsciously to us, right? And so it's your breathing rate, it's your heart rate, it's the rate of filtration in your kidneys. It's literally all these things are automatically happening. And we have 2 branches of that. And I know most people have heard of this. And it's you've heard of the sympathetic being the fight or flight response. And people hear of the parasympathetic as being the rest and digest response. And so what ultimately happens is when we are more sympathetic, we'll have less variability in the time between subsequent heartbeats. When we're more parasympathetic, more rest and digest, we'll have more variability. And so what this ultimately is it's a really cool way to measure your nervous system and your autonomic nervous system and to see what side of it is contributing more or less at any given time. Did I summarize that okay?
Oh man, that was a great presentation right there. That is
I should be a college instructor or something.
Totally. You obviously teach this for your class, so
I don't actually teach this.
Oh yeah. Oh, you hit on all the important points. One is that it's the time measure between beats. I loved how you explained that. And if people are reading this, they'll read it. It's called the RR interval.
Yeah.
And going back to my cardiac rehab days, you think of your standard EKG wave. I think people can probably picture that from any TV show. And it's the peak the highest point is the
Yeah.
R wave of that
Yeah.
EKG.
And I like to think of it like this, is like if you're watching like an ER show and you're seeing
Yep.
beep,
That's
beep,
right. That's
beep,
right.
it's the beep.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like you'd be measuring from the R to R is measuring from beep to beep.
Yep.
And when you're watching it on a show and they got it on an audio loop, it's probably has no variability.
Yep.
But in
And
reality, if you're sitting in somebody's hospital room and you really listen,
yep.
you can actually start to hear it go up and down as they breathe, which is even cooler.
The heart is a bad metronome.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
You know, a metronome from our musician friends is that device that you sit and it gives you that beat to, you know, keep the music going. Heart rate isn't like that. It's variable in its beat, and you explained that perfectly, and so I love it. And so let me just add a little bit to that. Where, you know, for people who read on heart rate variability, there's two ways to measure, or two general ways to measure how variable the heart rate is, because now you're not talking about what the heart rate is, you're talking about how variable that heartbeat is, and how it's changing from, you know, beat to beat. And one is the what's called the frequency domain, and the other is the time domain. And we won't do a deep dive on these right now, but it is important to know that there's different mathematical ways to try to get to heart rate variability. And so when you're reading the literature, sometimes you have to really recognize which technique they're using to quantify heart rate variability, because sometimes the message that you get is a little bit different if you look at the frequency domain versus the time domain. And I don't know, I won't go into too much detail, but it's just another way to dissect and pull information from heart rate.
And one of the things is when you start to look at this, and it goes in, these all go into mathematical equations, and then every company has their own kind of way of doing this.
Yep.
So if you get your HRV from a Whoop strap, or you get it from a Garmin watch, or you can't compare one to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is there's a lot of variability, and there's genetic variability in this as well. So I can't compare my HRV to yours. This is an individual metric. And I think that's important too. Like if you look up online, what's a good heart rate variability? It'll be like, well, higher is generally thought to be better. That's the answer, right? Not this is the number you're ultimately looking for. So
so now let's dive into this a little bit more. And I want to go over that nervous system control a little bit. So low heart rate variability would be very consistent time between beats. And if your metronome, variability is 0, because the metronome spot on, roughly 0. But lower is more consistent. Higher is more variable in terms of your heart rate. So if your heart rate's going from 100 and now it's 110 and now it's 90, I mean, that's extreme, but that more variable, more heart rate variability. All right, so now let's go through the nervous system, the control of heart rate. There's two systems you mentioned, parasympathetic and sympathetic. So which one is the fight to flight? Go through that again.
Okay, so the sympathetic is the fight or flight. And if you think about it, when you're doing an interval on your bike and you're working your butt off and you're going super hard, that's sympathetic dominant. Right. And you'll actually get very little heart rate variability during that. Like if we could measure, when we measure it live, very, very little. It'll be very consistent. If you're at 160 beats a minute, the time between each beat is very, very consistent. Now, the other side, the parasympathetic side, when you're at like 5, 6 in the morning and you're just pseudo-conscious, waking up, hopefully you're rested, your digestion is still happening, you're going to have the relaxed side of things, and you should have a lot of variability. Now, to me, the interesting thing is this stuff carries over day to day. And it doesn't just pay attention to your physical stress. The psychological stress goes into this as well, right? You could actually have really poor variability and not have before, but you had it really rough at work. You had some relationship issues, whatever the case may be. You could even have some health issues that are on your mind, whatever the stress of the day is. that can actually also alter this, because remember, this is the nervous system, and it's not just based off of your physical stress. And that's why I actually kind of like this as a metric, is because we're more than just what we do in training.
Right.
Right.
Oh, I love it. So parasympathetic, rest and digest. It's trying to get you back to homeostasis. And as that happens, the variability of your heart rate actually goes up.
Yeah.
And so this is, but it also slows your heart rate down.
Yep.
Whereas sympathetic is going to compete with the parasympathetic. It will actually drive that parasympathetic response down.
Yeah.
But
The way I look at it
becomes more variable.
is it's
Or
like it's constantly a tug of war.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
always have inputs on both sides. So if you have more stress, the sympathetic's going to be winning, but the parasympathetic is still there to be pulling it back, and it's basically it's going back and forth all the time between the two. Here's a fun little exercise if y'all are watching or listening at home, is to really try and slow your breathing down and wear your heart rate monitor as you're doing this. Get it down to like 5-6 breaths a minute, what you can do. So long, slow inhalations and exhalations. And if you really pay attention, you'll notice on your inhalations, your heart rate goes up. On your exhalations, your heart rate goes down. And it's really interesting. We think that heart rate, or that breathing in is more sympathetic, breathing out is more parasympathetic. So when you do like a meditation or some yoga things or whatever, you really concentrate on the long, slow breath out, and that gives you more parasympathetic. And we've known about this a long time, right? Where you got a kid that's, anxious and, they're upset. Okay, concentrate on your breathing, breathe out nice and slow. I mean, I've had athletes that have had asthma exacerbations, and I've talked them through it, right? By concentrating on getting more of the parasympathetic side by the long, slow breathe out. It's a really interesting phenomenon, how this tug of war is continually happening. The one other thing I'm going to add with the parasympathetic, and I think you're going there, but in sports in particular, we can try and train ourselves through like breathing techniques and different things to actually become more parasympathetic, which actually helps with your recovery from exercise. And digestion, exactly.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think that's the funny thing about sympathetic is that fight or flight will shut the digestion system down.
Yep.
And so it is something to be paying attention to it as we go along. And so heart rate variability is a way to try to get a sense of which of these nervous systems is predominant or dominant at any time, and how they're competing against each other.
Yeah, and one of the things we do with heart rate variability is we start to look at trends, because one day doesn't really give you a whole lot. Actually, doesn't give you anything. Even a couple days gives you very little. But when you start to see trends, for example, if your variability starts going down over time, you're in a heightened sense of stress. And it can be signs of overtraining, or it can just be signs of you actually have been training really hard, and now you need a recovery day.
Yeah.
Or you need a day of just easier workout, because that physical stress will manifest itself and put you in this more sympathetic state, even at rest. And ultimately that's how, when I use it, that's how I use it. And when I work with other people, and we do use it, that's how we use it as a guide. But it's not one day, one number.
Well, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is that when you quantify heart rate variability, sometimes you look at heart rate variability over 24 hours.
Yep.
And sometimes you look at it within a minute, sometimes 5 minutes, and sometimes even a smaller window. And so that's another funny, tricky thing about heart rate variability. And I mentioned this so that people are reading on heart rate variability, they do need to sort of understand, wait, what time period are we actually talking about? Are we talking about heart rate variability over 24 hours or over an 8-hour period or whatever it is, versus what's happening right now during exercise?
Yeah. So some sports teams are actually utilizing this, and it's interesting. one of the teams at UNLV is actually utilizing this,
Mhm.
but they're not allowed. They're using straps, but the straps are owned by the team, and they don't take them home at night because
Okay.
they're actually exercising in them. So
Mhm.
their rest time is when they're watching game film,
Mhm.
right? Because they're sitting down, they're watching the game film. And well, my thought is maybe that's not the best time, right? Because if you're making mistakes and the coach is like saying,
Yeah.
hey, this mistake, or when you make a mistake, or every time you watch the video, you missed a shot, or
Mhm.
you got tackled, or whatever the case may be, whatever sport you're in, that might not be the best time. But it's important to have the context of when you're taking your rest time. Is very important. And then we're going to get into trying to measure this while you're exercising and how difficult
Yeah.
of a metric it actually is to get.
No, and that's right, because I just quickly looked at my watch to see what my heart rate is. Now it's down to 45. So, but you're watching something stressful that can stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which is going to raise up your adrenaline within your system, that fight or flight system, and that will influence that heart rate variability measure.
Yeah, go to the horse racing track at Del Mar and have $10 on horse number 6, and coming around the corner, you're just sitting there,
Yeah.
but your heart rate's going to go up, and
Yeah.
your stress level is going to go up, and your heart rate variability is going to go down.
Well, and you and I have even talked, like, after doing this podcast, I still need to take a little bit of time and just sort of, bring things back down and, let that parasympathetic system sort of re-engage, get me back to homeostasis and, get into more of a relaxed state.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, so one of the metrics that we look at along with this, when you look at like sleep data, is
Hmm.
how long it takes your heart rate basically to get to your sleep level. And that's actually a sign of parasympathetic dominance later
Hmm.
into the evening, right? So I know for me, if we have a late swim practice, which we swim in the evenings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, it sometimes will take me till 1 o'clock in the morning
Right.
or 2 o'clock in the morning for my heart rate to get down into where it normally is for sleep. But
Hmm.
if I do some stress relieving activities like breathing and meditation,
Yep.
I can actually get it down
Yep.
quicker. But oftentimes I don't think about it. I'm just like, oh, I'm tired. And I fall asleep. Like,
Yep.
I'm tired, but I'm not in that same restful state.
No, that's why I turn email off after a certain time too, because that can raise that anxiety level and stress and same thing getting up in the morning. You don't want to jump right into things that are going to put you right at stress. You gotta ease into the day.
Yeah.
And something I want to mention though on some of the devices, because I took some notes here getting ready
Yeah.
for this. So I'm just looking at my notes, and a lot of the heart rate variability devices will give you what's called an LF to HF ratio,
Low
low
frequency,
frequency,
high
high
frequency.
frequency.
Yeah.
And I want to mention that because you're bringing it up, and this is great. The low frequency, that's that frequency domain math behind quantifying heart rate variability, and a low frequency represents the sympathetic nervous system, and the high frequency represents the parasympathetic. So by taking the ratio of those two numbers that are mathematically determined, you can get a sense of which system is sort of the dominant system.
Yep. Yep. And that's ultimately what most of these programs are doing. And
Yeah.
they're once again, you can go on to the App Store, or you can find it on your Garmin. You can
Hmm.
find a lot of places you can actually measure this, and they're going to give you a number. And that
Hmm.
number is,
Right.
what I've seen with people, is between like 30 and 75 or 80.
Hmm.
And once again, it's individual. It's
Yep.
completely individual. And so if you're every day and you're collecting this data and you're at 50, that's some kind of ratio they've built between the high frequency and the low frequency domain, and
Hmm.
it's giving you a score,
Yeah.
right? And if you move it up, it's more high frequency. Is that right? Sympathetic, no,
More,
parasympathetic is high frequency.
yeah, higher would be more low frequency, which would be more sympathetic. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
I know. See,
I'm
it's
getting this all
funny,
backwards.
and
But
this
anyways,
is this is why it's confusing, is because we're talking about variability of heart rate,
yeah.
and now we're talking now you what this is a ratio of the two systems. So you've got a couple of tricky mental gymnastics here.
So basically what I'm getting at is higher is better.
Yeah.
If you're,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you're ultimately, if you want to be more parasympathetic and more relaxed and more recovered,
Mm-hmm.
and remember, most of this time we're collecting this metric at rest.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's actually a relatively new thing that people are starting to use this during exercise.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, like traditionally it's been, you wake up, you put your heart rate monitor on, you sit on your bed. Actually, you usually go pee first. So there's a little bit of stress there holding your bladder. Go pee first, sit on the side of your bed and do either a 30-second or a minute reading.
Mm-hmm.
Goes into your computer, your iPhone, your iPad, your watch, or whatever, and you'll get your score for the day. That's the typical way it's been done. And coaches have used this for several years to be like, okay, you are not recovered from the last 2 days of training. You need, instead of doing this session today, we're going to do this session today. That is maybe a long, slow ride or a recovery run, or wow, like you're recovered really well from the last 2 days sessions. Your HRV is really high. Today we're going to hit it hard.
Mm-hmm.
And and that's been what has ultimately been done in I guess I would say higher level coaching.
Yeah.
For a while, and to varying degrees of success, I would say. At least listening to some higher level coaches talk about it. I don't know what you've seen with that, John.
Yeah, no, and let's talk a little. I want to talk a little bit about a study. Why I got into heart rate variability was back when we did some wetsuit fitting work, and I've always been interested in this. General advice on how to fit a wetsuit or how to pick a wetsuit, and general advice is if it doesn't feel too tight, it's too big.
Yeah.
And I hate that advice because too tight is not necessarily a good thing. Now, over the years, the neoprene has become more flexible in the way that designers are doing it and the manufacturers doing it, and they're getting a little bit more flexibility in the shoulders. But something that we looked at early on was what happens physiologically when you put too tight of a wetsuit on. And that was actually one of my grad students, Hrv Prado, who's going on into med school now, and he's an MD. And he was interested in heart rate variability when you have too tight of a wetsuit on. And so we did just an easy study. We didn't do any exercise. We just put people in either a normal size wetsuit or a size down. So something that was too tight. And interestingly, and this was all just rest, we did seated and prone. And interestingly, the sympathetic nervous system was more stimulated by using heart rate variability when they wore too tight of a wetsuit.
How cool is that?
I know, and you take a step back and you say, well, yeah, no, of course. Well, yes, of course, but we actually quantified it, and from there we really had evidence to say, hey, if you're going to get a wetsuit, don't use too tight as a criteria. That's not, if it feels too tight, you're already working against yourself on race day, because you've got a too tight of a wetsuit on, your blood pressure actually will go up a little bit. Your sympathetic nervous system is stimulated way before you even started exercising. So you're already working against yourself. So
yeah, that's so good. And actually, the one thing I'm going to add to that is you talk about racing is one thing the people that I've worked with and even myself, I never look at heart rate variability the morning of a race.
Okay.
Because it's not like I'm going to be like, oh, my heart rate variability is low, I'm going to have a bad race.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my heart rate variability is high, I'm going to have a good race.
Wow.
I'm going to race my race the best that I can race, right? And we've talked about my struggles with sleep and racing on the podcast before. And I know, like, if I don't sleep well, my heart rate variability is going to be horrible. And then that just adds to maybe the stress of the day already.
Yep.
So sometimes I'll track it, but I won't actually open up the app and look at it, because for me, it doesn't matter. And I've heard this from a lot of coaches as well, as they tell their athletes, don't look at it on race day, because it makes no difference, right? You had bad recovery overnight. Well, yeah, you only slept 4 hours. It's a typical response.
Yeah,
you had to wake up at 4 a.m. to get on a bus to go to T1 or whatever, whatever the case may be. Of course, you didn't have the greatest recovery.
Yeah.
And of course, you're going to be excited, right? Like, it's race day.
Mm-hmm.
Sympathetic nervous system is those
Yeah.
nerves that you have before you get in the water,
Right.
or you get in the morning, you're eating breakfast and you got a little shake to you. That's your sympathetic nervous system being
Mm-hmm.
excited.
Yep.
And so you expect that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even the day after the race,
Mm-hmm.
you when you race, even it doesn't matter, sprint race, Olympic
Mm-hmm.
distance, Ironman, you put your sympathetic nervous system to the test
Mm-hmm.
that day, and the next day it's going to be poor as well. I can remember the first time I really started paying attention to this, and I did a sprint race. I'm like, I was going to train the next day. It was a Saturday race. I'm going to train the next day. It was only like an hour and 10-minute race, and my heart rate variability was one of the lowest it had ever been the next day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, you know what? Maybe today is a day to rest rather than
Mm-hmm.
get back at it, or
Mm-hmm.
just. And I think I did just like a 30-40 minute spin, which I find really relaxing for myself, and that was, and the next day I had a good recovery
Yep.
rather than going to the well again and again and
Mm-hmm.
again.
Well, and what you're talking about is that your sympathetic system is the dominant system when you're seeing that. So, and that's the fight or flight.
Yep.
And so that's the stress. And so you're seeing a stress in your heart rate variability. And so that's a perfect, use of it and application. And, the studies that our content curator, Vernice, sent us, those were really interesting because they were talking about using heart rate variability to predict another physiological marker, which is blood lactate, and really, lactate threshold. And actually, there was a few studies that were demonstrating that you could use heart rate variability to predict lactate threshold, which
The first lactate turn point, though, right? It was more so. It was the
yeah,
VT, or ventilatory threshold 1, or
yeah,
LT1, lactate threshold 1.
right.
And I'm super interested in this. I literally just came across this 2 weeks ago.
Mm,
And we have been doing some work. We've done some work, you and I, on measuring blood lactate. And honestly, it is a hit or miss prospect,
it's a pain in the neck.
especially to find LT1. And
Yeah.
and John, let's quickly define LT1. Go ahead, and you want to
Oh
do that?
yeah, it's lactate threshold. It's where you start to see this initial change in the resting levels of lactate, and it's a very subtle change, and it's really hard to quantify by measuring blood lactate by finger prick measure. If we're in the lab and we're able to hook up something in the blood and measure it continuously that way, that's a little better. But the way that most of us do it, and we do this in our lab all the time, is finger prick, and that's really hard to get a good measure of blood lactate over time that way.
So, and why it's important is that's the point where most physiologists, I think, now would agree that below that is where you're going to be doing your aerobic training,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're talking about polarized training or 3-zone model or even 5-zone models. If you want to build your aerobic system the most efficiently with the least amount of stress, we're talking about lowest, or sorry, what was it?
Minimum effective
Minimum
dose.
effective dose, right?
Oh,
If you can get the same result of you working at a heart rate of 130 and a heart rate of 145, and you're gonna get the same result in the end, you might as well do the 130 because your legs are gonna be fresher.
Yep.
So that's a really important number, and finding that, once again, doing blood lactate, invasive, difficult, really hard to get the exact number. Other way we can do that is look at our first ventilatory threshold, which once again, we have to we could bring you in, put a mask on you, collect gas exchange, and once again, pretty invasive, difficult to do. This could be as simple as hooking you up to a heart rate monitor, having you do a testing protocol, which it's not a max testing protocol, it's just getting above that threshold. And we can start to see some stuff here. And once again, this is in its infancy. Like, we're starting to see some research on this, but I, for one, am super excited to start to collect this kind of data on myself and some of the people that I work with. What do you think, John?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And so again, from a heart rate perspective, as you start exercising at higher intensity, the sympathetic system kicks on more and more.
Yep.
And so the idea is that by looking at variability of the heart rate, which is going to be related to which nervous system is really the dominant one, if you can look at that to identify where that demarcation is in intensity, then you can say, hey, train at these levels or train at these levels. But this is why, and you and I are big advocates of this. If you're gonna go easy, you need to be easy. You can't. You want to stay away from that threshold, any threshold. You want to stay well below it or well above it.
Above
And
it.
that's where you're going to get your minimum effective dose, being on both sides, not in that sort of middle zone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think if you can
And
use
even,
heart
even
rate,
if you and even if you use that middle zone, because I know some people do for like tempo work, and there's some FTP work that can be done there.
yeah,
But it's more like if 80% of your work as a triathlete probably should be in the aerobic zone,
hmm
knowing where that aerobic
yep,
zone is,
yep,
it's really important.
that's right.
Like the threshold stuff, honestly, is not nearly as important. Like the upper end threshold, it's
hmm
this threshold I think is more important,
Yep.
and it's the one I think that more people mess up.
hmm
Right? Is like, because knowing if your number where you cross over to more sympathetic is, or you're at your LT1 ventilatory threshold 1 is at 140 or
hmm
130, that's a big difference.
Yep. That's right.
And so I want to know that number, and we've done it. We did it with lactate, and we've done it with
hmm
gas,
Yep.
and we've come out with pretty good numbers, and we're pretty satisfied with those. But that was a snapshot in time. This is something I could do every couple of weeks if I
Yeah. Right.
wanted to.
Right. That's right. No, that's right. Because now you don't necessarily need that protocol that we did.
Yeah.
And you can look at which system's kicking on to be as a marker of, hey, I need to stay away from this zone, or I need to be in this zone, so I need to be in this range of variability of heart rate. So no, it makes sense. There's still the problem is there's still math behind it,
Yeah. Oh,
because
for sure.
to get that heart rate variability, you need a device that samples heart rate at a sufficient rate. And a lot of heart rate monitors, they because the higher the sample rate, the more expensive the hardware is going to be. And so a lot of your heart rate monitors are very low sample rate. But to get this low frequency and I say high frequency, that high frequency range is below 1 hertz. And so in order to get to that level of detail, you actually need a high sample rate and a long period of time to actually sample over to make the math work, to be able to detect these frequency ranges that represent the different nervous systems. So like when we did our work, we were measuring data for over 5 minutes, and we were sampling at 1,000 hertz, and then going back and looking for those high and low frequency ranges, which are really, really low frequency numbers. So
The really cool thing is some of the software now with this is actually being able to tell you, is your data good or not?
yeah, yeah.
It's like doing some post-processing stuff and looking at,
hmm
is your data good enough, or is there too much artifact or too much missing time within this? And so I think, once again, it's in its infancy. It's pretty cool stuff. If you want to know more and look up more stuff, the metric is called DF alpha 1.
Mm.
And there's more and more information on this metric. Once again, I actually just downloaded the software to my phone
Okay.
this week. I have not had a chance to even test it out yet, because I'm away and I don't have my trainer. And really, you need a trainer where you can actually control your power.
Oh, okay. I haven't looked into this. So.
And it's a ramp. It's an actual ramp test that you do. And then you can do it running as well, but there's a lot more artifact in running because of just the movement of the body. The best way right now, at least in the literature, is to do it on a bike on a ramp test.
Okay.
And what they'd ultimately like to do is, and this isn't there yet, you can do it on your phone. There's an app called Hrv Logger where you can actually look at it live while you're actually riding your bike or running. You can actually literally see it live, but it's a problem of having your phone out all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So you can actually, because as you train, this number can actually change, and your actual heart rate where
That's
this
right.
number is can actually change. But what we'd like to see is this coming to your head unit on your bike computer, where you could actually see, or even have a little alarm to go off and say, hey, you know what, you're actually, you went above that threshold, let's back you back down.
Yeah. No, I love it. And you're right. I mean, there's so many, this is where we just need to be careful with this heart rate variability because there's so many things that will influence alcohol,
Yeah.
nutrition, like you've talked about, sleep, and even, depending on the device you're using, it can even be sometimes getting picked up by breathing rate can
Yeah.
influence it. So,
And
uh,
yeah, I'm gonna definitely say this, like the you said already, but the quality of the strap is
yeah,
critical. Optical is not good enough.
yep,
Like
yep,
I know
yep.
your watch can tell you this, or your Whoop strap or your Oura
Mhm,
Ring can tell you this, but during exercise, and this is critical,
mhm,
you have to have a super high quality strap.
mhm.
And at rest, not nearly as important, because when your heart rate is 50 beats a minute or 60
Right.
beats a minute, it's actually pretty easy. You start
Mhm.
getting your heart rate up 130, 140. If you're only sampling at 130 or 140,
Yeah.
you're missing, you're going to be missing out. And so right now, the ones that are validated, and I don't happen to own either of these, but now it's on my Christmas wish list. The Polar H7 has been validated, and that's not that expensive. The Polar H9 and H10.
Mhm.
Those are the only ones that I've seen so far that have actually had some good validation studies,
Yeah.
and they're not cheap.
No.
But and then the other thing that I just learned today is you have to actually do this with a Bluetooth connection,
Hmm.
not an Ant Plus connection,
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
because Ant Plus, I guess how it brings the data back and forth, or maybe
Mhm.
because it's only a one-way data stream, where Bluetooth
Oh, okay.
is two-way. So there's a lot of little pieces to this to make it work right.
Mm.
But once again, this is like new stuff
Yeah.
and some really cool stuff. And John, I can't wait to get us back in the lab and start to do some stuff with this, because I think it's pretty cool.
So bottom line is people should be looking at trends of heart rate variability. Don't look at any single number or any single time, but build the information over time, and you'll understand your heart rate variability better.
And I say for the average person, look at it first thing in the morning, like we talked about, and build the trend that way, and
Yeah.
have it the same time every day. That's the best way to build these trends. It's not, hey, I'm going to take it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then next day I'm going to take it at this time after I've had a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. It needs to, right now we're still at a point where it needs to be consistent. And yeah, it's some pretty cool stuff. One other thing I'm going to add is there are some apps out there that will actually do some really cool stuff, and where you can actually look at your HRV live,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'll give you like breathing exercises to
Mm.
actually bring it down, and you can actually watch the number move.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So I think there's one called Hrv Bio Feedback,
Okay.
is one of those ones that'll do that, and which is pretty interesting stuff, because I was thinking about that, like, if I know after swimming I can't fall asleep, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or I maybe could use something like that, like a breathing technique on this app,
Yeah.
and I can actually watch it go down, and then, okay, now go to sleep.
Oh, we'll have to do a topic on meditation at some point. Because I need to know more about it.
I
So,
need about 40 more minutes in the day that I can actually say, okay, that is my meditation time.
yeah, that's the tough part, right? It's
What do you give up, right? We talked about that last week with the strength training. Okay, I want to add, so I want to swim, bike, and run 15 hours a week. Then I
okay.
want to strength train like
Yeah.
3 hours a week. Oh, now I want to meditate every day for 40 minutes.
Where's the day go?
Where's the day go? I think so. We have some friends that have recently retired. That's what you got to do. You got to be retired to do all this stuff.
That that sounds enticing there.
It does.
Hey, this was a great topic. Boy, we covered a lot of ground. We knew we would, and we did. So this is good.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Hey, next weekend will be Christmas Eve, right?
Yeah, we'll be.
We'll be chatting on Christmas Eve. So that'll be for those of you that have nothing better to do on Christmas Eve.
I better check with the wife first.
Oh yeah, you better check with the wife first. I'll check with my wife. Oh, it's okay.
Well,
I'm
you better
glad.
check with Cosmo then.
Yeah, Cosmo's the one, because he'll be up waiting for Santa Claus. Scare the heck out of me.
Hey, this has been good. Thanks, Ted.
No, thank you, John. Hey, have a great weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.